My ex-wife became an investment banker and humiliated me in front of everyone just because I asked to invest $170. She sneered, "We don't serve poor beggars here." Minutes later, I withdraw my $8.5 billion portfolio, and the entire bank froze. My name is Reed Lawson, and let me tell you about the day I walked into Solon Trust Investment Bank with nothing but a crumpled $20 bill in my wallet and a dream that was about to turn into their worst nightmare. I wasn't looking for trouble that Tuesday morning. Hell, I was just trying to do something decent for once in my life. You know how it is when you find something you actually believe in? That's rare these days, especially in this godforsaken city where everyone's hustling and nobody gives a damn about anything except their next paycheck. The startup was called Greenleaf Solutions, some kid from Brooklyn who figured out how to turn food scraps into biodegradable packaging. Real smart kid. Reminded me of myself 20 years ago when I still thought the world owed me something. Anyway, I've been following their progress for months, watching them bootstrap their way through prototype after prototype, living off ramen noodles and hope. They needed investors, and I had exactly $170 burning a hole in my checking account. Not much, but hey, every giant oak started as an acorn, right? So there I was, walking through those ridiculous glass doors that probably cost more than most people make in a year, wearing my favorite pair of jeans, the ones with the hole near the left knee that my ex-wife always nagged me about, and a plain gray hoodie I'd picked up at Target. No fancy suit, no leather briefcase, no entourage of ass-kissing yes-men trailing behind me like some Wall Street hotshot. Just me, Reed Lawson, regular guy with calloused hands and a stubborn streak a mile wide. The lobby was all marble and chrome, the kind of place designed to make you feel small before you even open your mouth. Business people in $1,000 suits glided past like sharks in designer clothing, their phones glued to their ears, barking orders about acquisitions and leveraged buyouts. The whole scene reeked of old money and newer arrogance. I almost turned around right then, almost said forget it, and walked back out to my beat-up Honda Civic parked 3 blocks away because I wasn't about to pay $20 for valet parking. But I didn't. Something inside me, maybe it was stubbornness or maybe it was genuine hope, kept my feet moving toward the customer service counter. The woman behind the marble desk was typing away on her computer, not bothering to look up even though I'd been standing there for a solid minute. Professional courtesy, my ass. Finally, she raised her head, and that's when my world tilted sideways like a record player with a bent needle. Mira Glenmont. My ex-wife. The woman who'd walked out of our apartment 5 years ago with half our furniture, most of our savings, and all of my trust in human decency. She was wearing a power suit that probably cost more than I used to make in a month back when we were married. Her auburn hair pulled back in that severe bun she always wore when she was trying to intimidate someone. The years had been kind to her. She looked polished, successful, like she'd stepped out of a Forbes magazine spread about women breaking glass ceilings. For a split second, neither of us said anything. I could see the recognition dawning in her green eyes, followed quickly by something that looked suspiciously like disgust. Not surprise, not awkwardness, pure, undiluted disgust, like she'd just stepped in something unpleasant. Well, she said, her voice carrying that same condescending tone I remembered from our worst fights. Reed Lawson, what brings you to civilization? I cleared my throat, determined to keep this professional. I'd like to make an investment. Small amount, but it's for a good cause. There's this green energy startup. That's when she started laughing. Not a polite chuckle or even a surprised giggle, but a full-throated laugh that cut through the lobby's hushed atmosphere like a fire alarm. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Even the security guard by the elevator looked over to see what was so damn funny. Investment, she said, loud enough for half the floor to hear. You want to make an investment? How much are we talking here, Reed? Your lunch money. My face burned, but I kept my voice steady. $170. The laughter got louder. A couple of junior executives at a nearby table started snickering, whispering to each other behind their hands like high school kids watching someone get pantsed in the cafeteria. Mira stood up from her chair, smoothing down her skirt with theatrical precision. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced to anyone within earshot, we have a high roller in the house. Reed Lawson wants to invest his pocket change in our institution. More laughter rippled through the lobby. A security camera in the corner seemed to stare down at me like a mechanical eye, recording every humiliating second. Then came the words that would change everything. We don't serve poor beggars here. The room went dead silent. Not the comfortable quiet of a library or the focused hush of people working, but the kind of silence that happens right before a storm hits, when even the birds stop singing because they know something bad is coming. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, feeling dozens of eyes boring into me, watching to see how the beggar would react to being put in his place. Part of me wanted to argue, to defend myself, to explain that I wasn't some homeless guy wandering in off the street looking for a handout. Another part wanted to slink away with my tail between my legs, disappear into the crowd on the sidewalk outside, and pretend this whole thing never happened. Instead, I did something that probably surprised everyone in that lobby, including myself. I smiled. Not a bitter, sarcastic smile or a wounded attempt at saving face, but a genuine, almost peaceful smile. I nodded once at Mira, like she'd just told me something interesting about the weather, and turned toward the exit. But as I walked away, my mind was already working, already calculating, already planning. Because Mira Glenmont had just made the biggest mistake of her professional life, and she had absolutely no idea what was coming. The glass doors closed behind me with a soft whoosh, and I stepped back into the real world where regular people drove regular cars and worried about regular problems. But I wasn't a regular person anymore, and I hadn't been for a very long time. I just let them all believe I was. Nobody in that fancy marble palace knew who the hell they were really dealing with, and honestly, that's exactly how I'd planned it for the past 5 years. See, when you've been burned as badly as I had, you learn to keep your cards close to your chest. So close that even your own reflection doesn't know what you're holding. The whole sorry mess started right after Mira walked out on our marriage. I remember that day like it was yesterday. Came home from my construction job to find half our apartment cleaned out and a note on the kitchen counter that might as well have been written in poison ink. Read, it said, I can't waste any more of my life waiting for you to become somebody. Don't try to find me. Real classy, right? She'd even taken the coffee maker, which honestly hurt more than losing her at that point. But here's the thing about rock bottom. It gives you a solid foundation to build on. 3 weeks after she split, I got the call that changed everything. My grandfather's lawyer, some old school guy named Patterson who wore bow ties and still used a rotary phone, told me I'd inherited something from the old man. Grandpa Joe had always been the family mystery, the guy who worked nights at the rail yard but somehow managed to send 3 kids to college and buy a house on the lake. Turns out, that wasn't all he'd managed to do. Your grandfather was quite the investor, Patterson had said, sliding a manila folder across his desk that looked like it weighed about 10 pounds. He left specific instructions that this inheritance was to remain confidential until you turned 35. Congratulations, son, you just became a very wealthy man. Wealthy didn't even begin to cover it. Grandpa Joe had spent 40 years quietly buying up small parcels of land, investing in tiny companies that nobody else believed in, and rolling every penny of profit back into the next opportunity. By the time he passed, his portfolio was worth just north of $3 million. Not billionaire money, sure, but enough to make a man think twice about his next move. Most people would have bought a fancy car or a bigger apartment, maybe taken a trip to Europe or thrown themselves a party. Me? I disappeared. Completely. Told everyone I was going to find myself, maybe travel the country, figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Classic post-divorce midlife crisis stuff that nobody questioned. Instead, I spent 6 months holed up in a 1-bedroom studio apartment above a Chinese restaurant in Queens, reading everything I could get my hands on about finance, investment strategies, and corporate structures. I devoured books on Warren Buffett, Ray Dalio, and every other investing legend who'd ever made a dollar in the market. I studied shell companies, private equity firms, and offshore banking laws until my eyes bled. Most importantly, I learned how to stay invisible while making very visible moves in the financial world. That's when K. Ramil was born. Sounds sophisticated, doesn't it? Like some European aristocrat, or maybe a mysterious billionaire from a spy novel. Truth is, it's just my middle name, Kendrick, and my grandmother's maiden name turned backward. Simple, but it did the job. K. Ramil became the face of Redbridge Equities, a private investment firm that specialized in finding diamonds in the rough. While Mira was climbing the corporate ladder at Solon Trust, schmoozing with clients and playing office politics, I was quietly building an empire. Started small, bought into a struggling tech company that was developing better battery technology. When Tesla started taking off, guess who had a supply contract locked up? Moved into renewable energy next, then pharmaceutical startups, then real estate development in markets that everyone else was sleeping on. The beautiful thing about being K. Ramil was that nobody connected him to Reed Lawson, the construction worker from Brooklyn whose wife had left him for being a loser. Reed Lawson drove a beat-up Honda and lived in a studio apartment. K. Ramil owned a portfolio worth billions and had meeting requests from Fortune 500 CEOs. But here's the real kicker, the part that would have made Myra's head explode if she'd known. Half of K. Ramil's massive portfolio was being managed by none other than Solon Trust Investment Bank. Through a network of third-party custodians and shell companies, Redbridge Equities had quietly become one of their biggest clients. Every month, Solon Trust was collecting management fees on investments that ultimately belonged to the same guy they'd just called a beggar. I'd watch from the shadows as they published their quarterly reports, bragging about their assets under management, their stellar performance numbers, their exclusive client relationships. They'd throw parties celebrating their success, give interviews about their investment prowess, and all the while, they were dancing to music played by a ghost they didn't even know existed. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mira had spent years working her way up to senior VP, handling accounts worth hundreds of millions, building relationships with high-net-worth individuals, and she'd never once realized that her biggest client was the same man she'd written off as worthless. Every quarterly statement that crossed her desk, every portfolio review she conducted, every client meeting she attended, somewhere in that mix was money that traced back to Reed Lawson, the failure she'd married and divorced. The construction worker who couldn't afford to take her to nice restaurants was now funding the very bonuses that paid for her designer suits. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about building something real while everyone else was playing pretend. While they were impressed by titles and corner offices, I was creating actual value, actual wealth, actual power. The kind that doesn't need a nameplate on a door or a reserved parking space. But sitting on that bench outside Solon Trust, watching Myra's laughter echo through those glass walls, I realized something important. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't the one nobody sees coming. Sometimes it's the one that reminds everyone exactly who they're dealing with. The bench outside Solon Trust was one of those fancy wrought iron jobs that the city puts up to make downtown look classy, but it might as well have been a throne for what I was about to do. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, just watching the suits hurry past on the sidewalk. All of them too busy checking their phones to notice the guy in jeans who was about to bring down one of the biggest investment banks in the state. Funny thing about power, real power, not the kind that comes with a corner office and a secretary, is that it's quietest right before it makes the most noise. I pulled out my phone, an old iPhone that I'd had for 3 years because, hey, if it ain't broke, why fix it? The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to move more money with this beat-up piece of technology than most people see in a lifetime. Ida Marino's number was the third one in my favorites list, right after my pizza place and my barber. That should tell you something about my priorities. Ida had been my legal counsel for 4 years, ever since I'd needed someone sharp enough to handle the increasingly complex web of shell companies and investment vehicles that made up the Ramil empire. She was a bulldog in a Chanel suit, the kind of lawyer who could find loopholes in a circle and make opposing counsel cry for their mothers. The phone rang twice before her crisp voice came through. Reed, this is unexpected. Aren't you supposed to be keeping a low profile today? Change of plans, I said, watching a hot dog vendor set up his cart across the street. Amazing how normal life just keeps on rolling even when you're about to drop a financial nuclear bomb. I need you to initiate full asset withdrawal from Solon Trust. There was a pause. With Ida, pauses meant she was already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles and consequences like a chess grandmaster. Define full, Reed. All $8.5 billion. Every penny that Redbridge has tied up in their investment vehicles, their managed funds, their custodial accounts, everything. I want it gone by close of business today. Another pause, longer this time. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. That's going to cause some serious waves. Solon Trust probably doesn't have that kind of liquidity sitting around in cash. They'll have to start selling positions, calling in favors, maybe even hit up other banks for emergency loans. Good, I said, and I meant it. Let them scramble. What happened in there, Reed? This isn't like you. You're usually Mr. Patience, Mr. Long-Term Strategy. This feels, she searched for the right word, personal. I looked up at the glass tower looming over me. Somewhere up there behind those tinted windows, Mira was probably still laughing with her colleagues about the beggar who wanted to invest his lunch money. It is personal, but it's also business. Bad business to insult clients, even small ones. Especially when you don't know who you're really dealing with. All right, Ida said, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. I'll start with the offshore accounts first. Those will be the easiest to move without triggering immediate red flags. Then I'll hit the domestic portfolios. This is going to be like pulling the bottom card out of a house of cards. You realize that, right? That's the idea. And when they start asking questions, because they will, probably within the hour. Solon Trust's risk management department isn't stupid. They'll know something's up when their biggest ghost client suddenly vanishes. I stood up from the bench, stretching my legs and watching a pigeon peck at a discarded bagel. Amazing how simple life was when you were a pigeon. See food, eat food, fly away. No complicated revenge schemes or billion-dollar chess moves. Tell them the truth. Tell them Reed Lawson requested the withdrawal. Reed Lawson? Not Ramil. Reed Lawson. The construction worker. The failure. The beggar. I started walking toward my car, each step feeling lighter than the last. I want them to know exactly who just pulled the rug out from under them. Jesus, Reed. What did they do to you in there? I stopped walking, remembering Myra's laugh, the way it had cut through the lobby like a knife. They reminded me why I left this world behind in the first place, and why I built a better one without them. Okay, I'm on it. But Reed, you need to understand what this means. Once I pull the trigger on this, there's no going back. Solon Trust is going to be in full panic mode. Their stock price will probably tank when word gets out. People are going to lose jobs. Retirement accounts are going to take a hit. Then maybe they should have thought about that before they decided to humiliate someone just trying to do a good deed. Fair enough. I'll also notify the Financial Regulatory Board, just to make sure everything's above board on our end. If Solon Trust tries to freeze the accounts or claim some kind of irregularity, I want us bulletproof from a legal standpoint. Good thinking. How long until the first domino falls? 20 minutes, maybe 30. I'll start with the European markets. They're still open, and we can move about $2 billion through our London partners before Solon Trust even knows what hit them. Then I'll cascade through Asia Pacific, and by the time New York realizes what's happening, we'll be pulling the domestic portfolios. I reached my Honda and fished the keys out of my pocket. The parking meter still had 40 minutes left on it, but I had a feeling I wouldn't be needing it. Do it, Reed. For what it's worth, I think they picked the wrong guy to mess with. Yeah, I said, looking back up at the glass tower one more time. They really did. I hung up and sat in my car, engine running, air conditioning blowing, watching the pedestrians go about their normal Tuesday afternoon routines. In about 20 minutes, the elevators in that building were going to start moving a lot faster, carrying a lot more panicked people than usual. Risk managers would be pulling up spreadsheets, account executives would be frantically calling clients, and somewhere in that maze of marble and chrome, Mira Glenmont was about to learn that some jokes cost more than others. The beauty of it was, I didn't have to do anything else. I'd given the order, Ida would execute it, and gravity would take care of the rest. Sometimes the most devastating attacks are the ones where you just step back and let your enemy's own system collapse under the weight of their mistakes. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving Solon Trust in my rearview mirror. By tomorrow morning, they'd remember this day as the one where everything changed. and they'd remember Reed Lawson as the man who changed it. Inside the glass tower of Solon Trust, the first sign of trouble came as a soft ping from Martin Yoon's computer at exactly 2:47 p.m. Martin had been the head of risk management for 8 years, long enough to know that in the investment world, soft pings usually meant loud problems were heading your way like a freight train with busted brakes. He glanced at his monitor while finishing his turkey sandwich, the same boring lunch he'd been eating for the past decade because his wife insisted it was healthier than the pizza he actually wanted. The alert was routine at first glance. Large portfolio movement, European markets. Nothing unusual there. Rich clients moved money around all the time, especially when they were trying to beat currency fluctuations or chase better returns in overseas markets. But then another ping, and another. Within 5 minutes, his screen looked like a Christmas tree having an epileptic fit, alerts cascading down faster than he could read them. Portfolio withdrawal, account 47291, liquidation notice, London division, emergency transfer protocol, K. Ramil Holdings. Martin's sandwich suddenly tasted like cardboard. K. Ramil was their whale, the mysterious billionaire whose investment vehicles represented nearly 15% of Solon Trust's total assets under management. In the banking world, 15% might not sound like much, but when you're talking about billions of dollars, 15% was the difference between champagne bonuses and cardboard boxes filled with personal belongings. What the hell? Martin muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he pulled up the detailed transaction logs. The numbers that popped up on his screen made his stomach drop faster than a broken elevator. $2 billion had just vanished from their European portfolios. Not moved, not transferred, vanished, pulled out completely by K. Ramil's investment firm, Redbridge Equities. His phone started ringing before he could fully process what he was seeing. The caller ID showed London office, urgent. Martin, we've got a situation, came the voice of Sarah Chun, Solon Trust European operations manager. She sounded like she'd been running a marathon while drinking espresso. Redbridge just pulled everything. Every single position, every managed fund, every custodial account. They're liquidating their entire European portfolio. How much? Martin asked, though he already knew the answer would make him want to start drinking at 3 in the afternoon. 2.3 billion. They gave us the standard notice periods, so it's all legal, but Jesus Christ, Martin, this is like watching someone yank the foundation out from under a skyscraper. Martin's other line started blinking, then his cell phone. Then the emergency alert system that was supposed to be reserved for actual emergencies, not random Tuesday afternoons when mysterious billionaires decided to take their ball and go home. Sarah, I've got to call you back. Sounds like London was just the appetizer. He hung up and grabbed the next call. Yoon here. Martin, this is Tokyo. We've got multiple Redbridge accounts liquidating simultaneously. What's the word from your end? Before Martin could answer, his computer chimed again. This time, it wasn't a soft ping. It was the angry red alert that meant someone somewhere was about to have a very bad day. Liquidity warning. Domestic portfolios, screamed the message. Estimated withdrawal. $4.2 billion. Immediate execution requested. Oh, shit, Martin whispered, loud enough that Jennifer from compliance looked over from her cubicle with raised eyebrows. Martin never swore at work. Martin was the guy who said darn when he spilled coffee on his tie. His desk phone rang again. This time the caller ID just said CEO direct line. Martin. The voice belonged to James Thornton, Solon Trust CEO, and he sounded like a man watching his retirement fund evaporate in real time. My office. Now. And bring whoever's in charge of the Ramil account. Sir, that would be. Well, technically the account is handled through our third-party custodial services, so I don't care if it's handled by trained monkeys. Find out who knows something about this and get them up here. We've got board members calling, asking why our stock price just dropped 12% in the last 20 minutes. Martin's blood pressure spiked. If the stock price was already moving, that meant word was getting out. In the financial world, rumors traveled faster than bad sushi through a wedding reception. On my way, sir. He grabbed his laptop and started jogging toward the elevator, his mind racing through the implications. If Redbridge was pulling out completely, they'd have to liquidate positions across multiple markets to cover the withdrawals. That meant selling stocks, bonds, commodities, everything, at whatever price they could get. In a forced liquidation, you didn't get to wait for good prices. You took what the market gave you and hoped you'd still have a job tomorrow. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like it took about 6 years. Martin's phone buzzed with text messages from colleagues, traders, and account managers, all asking the same basic question. What the hell is happening? Meanwhile, 3 floors down in the customer service area, Mira Glenmont was holding court in the break room, still riding the high of her performance art from earlier. She'd gathered a small audience of junior associates and was regaling them with an exaggerated version of her encounter with the pathetic beggar who'd wanted to invest his pocket change. You should have seen his face, Mira was saying, making grand gestures with her coffee cup. This loser in his ratty jeans and hoodie, asking to invest $170 like he was some kind of high roller. I mean, what kind of person shows up at an investment bank with lunch money? Her audience chuckled appropriately, the way people do when their boss is telling a story and they want to keep their jobs. Nobody mentioned that most of them had started their own investment portfolios with amounts that weren't much bigger than Reed's $170. Nobody wanted to be the next target of Myra's wit. The best part, Mira continued, was when I told him we don't serve poor beggars. You could hear a pin drop in that lobby. Pure theater. That's when Martin Yoon burst through the break room door like a man whose hair was on fire, his laptop clutched against his chest, and his face the color of week-old milk. "Mira," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "What did you do to a man named Reed Lawson?" The laughter in the room died like someone had flipped a switch. Mira blinked, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. "What? Reed Lawson? Earlier today. What exactly did you say to him?" Myra's confident smirk faltered. "He's nobody, Martin. Just some random guy who wandered in off the street wanting to invest his allowance." "What?" Martin's laptop chimed with another alert. He glanced at the screen and watched his career flash before his eyes. Because Reed Lawson is listed as the primary contact for every single account associated with Redbridge Equities. And Redbridge just pulled $8.5 billion out of our bank. The break room went quiet enough to hear the coffee machine gurgling in the corner. Myra's face went from confident to confused to absolutely terrified in about 3 seconds flat. "That's impossible," she whispered. Martin looked at her with the expression of a man watching the Titanic's captain insist there was no iceberg. "Tell that to our stock price." By noon, the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of Solon Trust looked like a war room during the final days of a losing battle. The mahogany table that usually hosted polite discussions about quarterly projections and client retention strategies was now covered with laptops, tablets, printed spreadsheets, and enough empty coffee cups to caffeinate a small army. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the city skyline, but nobody was admiring the scenery today. Mira sat in one of the leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars, but she might as well have been sitting on a bed of nails. Her perfectly styled hair was starting to show signs of stress. A few strands had escaped from her professional bun, and she kept tucking them behind her ear in a nervous gesture that would have been cute if the circumstances weren't so dire. The power suit that had made her feel invincible this morning now felt like armor that was about 3 sizes too small. Around the table sat the heavy hitters of Solon Trust's executive team. James Thornton, the CEO, who looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past 2 hours. Patricia Wells, the chief financial officer, who was frantically scribbling calculations on a legal pad. David Chong, the head of client relations, who kept checking his phone like he was expecting a miracle. And Martin Yoon, still clutching his laptop like a life preserver, his tie loosened and his usually perfect composure completely shot. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Thornton was saying, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that precedes volcanic eruptions. "Our largest private client, representing 15% of our total assets under management, has just liquidated his entire portfolio because one of our senior VPs decided to publicly humiliate him in our lobby." Mira opened her mouth to defend herself, but Thornton held up a hand that could have stopped traffic. "I'm not finished. This client, who we apparently never bothered to properly identify despite managing $8.5 billion of his money, walked into our bank asking to invest $170, presumably as a test of our customer service, and our response was to call him a beggar in front of a room full of witnesses." The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Outside, the city hummed with its normal afternoon energy, but inside this boardroom, it felt like the end of the world was being discussed in hushed, professional tones. That's when the conference room door opened, and I walked in. I'll admit, I put a little more effort into my appearance this time. Still no $1,000 suit. That would have been too obvious, but I'd swapped the hoodie for a clean button-down shirt and thrown on a sport jacket that I'd bought off the rack at Men's Warehouse 3 years ago. The same jeans, though. Some things don't change. The reaction was immediate and electric. Myra's face went white as fresh snow, her mouth falling open like she'd just seen a ghost walk through the wall. Thornton started to stand, then seemed to remember he didn't know who the hell I was supposed to be. The others just stared, trying to figure out if I was Reed Lawson the construction worker or K. Ramil the billionaire, because apparently their brains couldn't process the idea that both could be the same person. "Gentlemen, Mira." I nodded politely as I took the empty chair at the head of the table, the one usually reserved for Thornton during board meetings. Nobody stopped me. In situations like this, confidence is 90% of the game, and I've been playing this particular game for 5 years. Martin cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Ramil? Mr. Lawson? I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to." "Reed is fine," I said, pulling a manila folder from my jacket and placing it on the table. The folder was thick enough to be impressive, but not so thick as to be intimidating. Inside were the transfer authorization forms that Ida had prepared, along with a few other documents that would make this meeting very short and very final. I know this is all a bit confusing, so let me clear things up. I opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper toward the center of the table. The letterhead read Redbridge Equities in simple, elegant font, and the document itself was titled Transfer Authorization, Complete Portfolio Closure, $8.5 billion. "This morning, I came to your bank as Reed Lawson, construction worker, hoping to make a small investment in a company I believe in. I was treated like garbage by someone who should have known better." I looked directly at Mira, who seemed to be having trouble breathing. "This afternoon, I'm here as K. Ramil, founder of Redbridge Equities, to formally notify you that we're terminating our business relationship." Thornton found his voice first. "Mr. Lawson, Mr. Ramil, surely we can work something out. What happened this morning was completely unacceptable, and I assure you that appropriate disciplinary action will be taken. Perhaps we could discuss some form of compensation for the inconvenience." $15 million, I said quietly. The room went silent again. Thornton blinked. "I'm sorry. $15 million. That's what Solon Trust made in management fees from my accounts last year. Not bad for managing the money of a beggar, wouldn't you say? Mira made a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a gasp. She was staring at the documents on the table like they were written in ancient hieroglyphics, her brain apparently unable to process the numbers she was seeing. The withdrawal is already in progress, I continued, my voice calm and matter of fact. By close of business today, every penny that Redbridge has invested through Solon Trust will be gone. Your European divisions have already processed their liquidations. Asia Pacific is wrapping up now. The domestic portfolios should be cleared within the next 2 hours. Patricia Wells, the CFO, finally spoke up. Mr. Ramil, you have to understand, a withdrawal of this magnitude will have serious consequences. Not just for Solon Trust, but for the broader market. When word gets out that we've lost a client of your caliber, then you shouldn't have insulted me, I said simply. I stood up, leaving the folder on the table. The paperwork is all there. My legal team has already filed the necessary notifications with the regulatory authorities. Everything is completely above board and by the book. I walked around the table to where Mira was sitting, her hands shaking as she stared at the transfer documents. She looked up at me with eyes that were equal parts terror and disbelief. This isn't about revenge, Mira, I said quietly, just loud enough for the room to hear. This is about respect, something you never learned to give. I straightened up and looked around the table at the assembled executives, these masters of the financial universe who were learning that universe was bigger than they'd thought. Gentlemen, it's been educational. Mira, it's been enlightening. I walked toward the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. Oh, and James. I looked back at the CEO, who was still staring at the paperwork like it might disappear if he concentrated hard enough. You might want to start working on your press release. This story's going to be all over the financial news by tomorrow morning. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I left them to contemplate the wreckage of their afternoon. 42 floors below, the city continued its normal rhythm, completely unaware that one of its most respected investment banks had just learned a very expensive lesson about customer service. The elevator ride down from the 42nd floor felt like a victory lap in reverse. Instead of celebrating, I was watching the numbers tick down while knowing that behind me, 42 stories up, some of the smartest financial minds in the city were probably losing their collective shit, trying to figure out how to stop a financial avalanche that was already halfway down the mountain. My phone buzzed as I hit the lobby. Text from Ida. European transfers complete. Asia Pacific wrapping up ahead of schedule. Domestic portfolios liquidating now. You've officially become Solon Trust's worst nightmare. I smiled as I pushed through the same glass doors I'd entered through this morning. The security guard who'd watched Mira humiliate me earlier gave me a polite nod, completely oblivious to the fact that the guy in jeans had just cost his employer more money than most small countries make in a year. Amazing how invisible you can be when people don't expect to see you. My Honda was still parked 3 blocks away, right where I'd left it, with 2 minutes left on the meter. I fed it another quarter out of habit. Old patterns die hard, even when you're rich enough to buy the entire parking authority. As I drove away from downtown, my phone started buzzing like an angry hornet. The first call was from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then another. Then 3 more in quick succession. Word was already spreading through the financial grapevine faster than gossip at a high school reunion. In the investment world, news like this travels at light speed, especially when it involves amounts that could fund a small war. But the call that made me pull over came from a number I definitely recognized. Mira. I stared at the screen for a long moment, watching her name flash like a neon sign advertising desperation. Part of me wanted to answer, to hear what she had to say now that the tables had been completely flipped. The other part of me remembered her laughter echoing through that marble lobby, the way she'd announced my poverty to a room full of strangers like it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. I declined the call. Immediately, my phone buzzed with a text. Read, please. We need to talk. This is insane. Then another. You can't be serious about this. $8 billion over a misunderstanding. Then, answer your damn phone. I turned the phone face down and kept driving. Behind me, though I couldn't see it from my Honda, Solon Trust was erupting into the kind of controlled chaos that happens when very smart people realize they're about to become very unemployed people. Martin Yoon was probably running between departments like a man whose hair was on fire, trying to coordinate damage control across 3 continents and 5 time zones. The legal department was undoubtedly scrambling to find some clause, some technicality, some Hail Mary loophole that could stop the bleeding. But Ida Moreno was too good at her job for that kind of amateur hour bullshit. Every document had been filed correctly, every notice period observed, every regulatory requirement satisfied down to the last comma. Redbridge Equities wasn't breaking any rules. We were just taking our ball and going home, which was perfectly legal when you owned the ball and the court it was played on. The beauty of what was happening was its simplicity. No complex schemes, no insider trading, no regulatory violations that would bring federal investigators sniffing around. Just a straightforward business decision made by a client who no longer felt valued by a service provider. It was capitalism in its purest form. Vote with your wallet, and when your wallet has $8.5 billion in it, your vote carries a lot of weight. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Mira. You've ruined me. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there for a moment, engine running, air conditioning humming, staring at those 4 words on my screen. You've ruined me. As if what happened in that lobby had been some kind of natural disaster, some random act of God that she couldn't have prevented. I typed back, no Mira, You did that when you laughed in my face. Then I blocked her number. The truth was, I hadn't ruined Mira Glenmont. Mira Glenmont had ruined Mira Glenmont the moment she decided that a person's worth could be measured by the balance in their checking account. She'd ruined herself when she chose cruelty over kindness, when she picked public humiliation over simple courtesy, when she forgot that every person who walks through those glass doors deserves basic human dignity, regardless of how much money they want to invest. What I'd done was simply reveal the consequences of her choices. I'd held up a mirror and shown her what it looks like when the universe decides to balance the scales. Some people call it karma. Some call it justice. I just called it business. Back at Solon Trust, the emergency protocols were in full swing. James Thornton was probably on a conference call with the board of directors, trying to explain how their most profitable client had vanished in the span of a single afternoon. The PR department was likely crafting carefully worded statements about strategic portfolio realignments and mutual business decisions, because nobody wanted to admit that their senior VP had insulted a billionaire and cost the company its biggest account. The fund managers were scrambling to liquidate positions without crashing the prices of the stocks they were selling. When you need to dump several $1 billion worth of assets in a matter of hours, you don't get to be picky about timing or market conditions. You sell at whatever price you can get and hope the bleeding stops before you hit an artery. Meanwhile, the compliance department was probably pulling every email, every transaction record, every piece of documentation related to the Redbridge accounts, looking for any sign that they'd missed something important. They'd find plenty of red flags in hindsight: mysterious shell companies, offshore accounts, complex investment structures that should have triggered additional due diligence. But hindsight is always 20/20 when you're staring at a financial crater where your biggest client used to be. The irony was that they'd been managing K. Ramil's money flawlessly for years. The returns were solid, the fees were reasonable, the service was professional. If Mira had simply treated Reed Lawson with basic courtesy this morning, if she'd taken his $170 investment with a smile and a thank you, none of this would have happened. Redbridge would still be Solon Trust's whale client, generating millions in annual fees, and Mira would still be a rising star with a corner office and a bright future. Instead, she was probably sitting in that same corner office right now, staring at her computer screen and watching her career implode in real time. All because she forgot the first rule of customer service: treat every customer like they might be your most important one, because you never know when they actually are. 2 days later, I was sitting on the deck of my lake house with my morning coffee and a copy of the Financial Tribune spread out on the weathered wooden table that my grandfather had built with his own hands back in 1967. The lake was glass smooth in the early morning light, reflecting the pine trees on the far shore like a mirror that had never heard of bad news or corporate disasters. A loon called out somewhere in the distance, probably wondering why the hell humans made everything so complicated when life could be as simple as fishing for breakfast and taking naps in the sun. The lake house had been my refuge for the past 5 years, the place where Reed Lawson could exist without worrying about K. Ramil's portfolio or Redbridge Equity's next acquisition. It was a modest place by billionaire standards: 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a kitchen that still had the original appliances from the 80s, and a deck that had seen better decades. But it was mine, paid for with honest money from my grandfather's inheritance. And it was the one place on earth where I could drink coffee from a chipped mug and not give a damn about stock prices or quarterly reports. The newspaper felt different that morning, heavier somehow, like it was carrying more weight than usual. And there, on page 3 of the business section, was the headline I'd been expecting: Solon Trust issues public apology following client incident. I leaned back in my chair, an old Adirondack number that creaked like a ship in a storm, and read the article with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching karma finally cash a check that's been a long time coming. Solon Trust Investment Bank issued a formal public apology yesterday, following an incident that resulted in the departure of one of their largest private clients. The bank's CEO, James Thornton, acknowledged that a senior executive had treated a potential client inappropriately during a recent visit to their downtown headquarters. I had to laugh at that. Inappropriately was corporate speak for like a complete asshole, but newspapers had to keep things family-friendly. The article continued with the usual boilerplate language about regrettable incidents and commitment to excellence, but buried in the middle was the line that made my coffee taste even better. We sincerely apologize to Mr. Reed Lawson for a regrettable incident involving one of our senior executives. Respect and integrity remain our core values, and we are taking immediate steps to ensure that all clients, regardless of the size of their investment, receive the professional treatment they deserve. There it was, in black and white, for every financial professional in the country to read over their morning bagels and overpriced lattes. Solon Trust Investment Bank, the same institution that had called me a beggar 2 days ago, was now publicly kissing my ass in the financial equivalent of a full-page apology ad. But the real kicker came in the final paragraph, buried where casual readers might miss it, but industry insiders would catch every word. The bank also announced the resignation of Senior Vice President Mira Glenmont, effective immediately. Ms. Glenmont had been with Solon Trust for 7 years and was considered a rising star in the organization's client relations division. I read that sentence 3 times, savoring each word like fine wine. Mira Glenmont, the woman who'd married me when I was nobody and divorced me when I was still nobody, the woman who'd built her career on climbing over other people to reach the next rung of the corporate ladder, was now officially unemployed. Not transferred, not demoted, not given a quiet desk job in some back office where she could ride out the storm. Resigned. In the corporate world, resigned usually meant fired, but we're letting you keep your dignity on the way out the door. I folded the newspaper and walked inside to my office, a converted bedroom that held my computer, a few filing cabinets, and the world's most comfortable desk chair that I'd bought from a bankruptcy auction 3 years ago. On the wall above my desk hung a simple wooden frame containing 2 photographs. One of my grandfather in his railroad overalls, grinning at the camera with dirt under his fingernails and pride in his eyes. The other of my grandmother in her garden, wearing a sun hat and holding a basket of tomatoes that she'd grown from seeds. Below those photos, I had pinned a quote that my grandmother used to say whenever the neighbors gossiped about people who'd fallen on hard times. Let your silence plant seeds. When it blooms, they'll choke on their own weeds. I unpinned the newspaper clipping and placed it in the frame, right below Grandma's picture. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who taught me about patience and quiet strength would have appreciated the symmetry of this moment. She'd always believed that people who treated others badly would eventually face consequences for their actions, that the universe had a way of settling accounts when you least expected it. The newspaper article would look perfect there, a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or flashy or dramatic. Sometimes it's just letting people face the natural consequences of their own choices, letting them choke on their own weeds while you tend to your own garden. My phone buzzed with a text from Ida. Saw the Tribune article. I'm assuming you're feeling pretty satisfied this morning. I typed back. Justice tastes like good coffee and better newspaper headlines. What's next? Media interviews? Victory laps around Wall Street. I looked out the window at the lake, where a family of ducks was paddling by in perfect formation, completely unconcerned with human drama or corporate politics. Nothing. I'm going fishing. And that was the truth. I'd made my point. Solon Trust had learned their lesson, and Mira was facing the consequences of her choices. The money was already being put to better use through my Community Futures Fund, supporting the kind of people that Mira would have called beggars, but who I knew were just folks trying to build something better for themselves and their families. The beautiful thing about real power is that once you've used it, you don't need to keep flexing it. The world had seen what happened when someone disrespected Reed Lawson, and that lesson would ripple through the financial community for years to come. Every banker, every investment advisor, every customer service representative would think twice before dismissing someone based on their appearance or the size of their initial investment. I poured myself another cup of coffee and headed back out to the deck. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning mist and revealing the lake in all its natural glory. Somewhere in the city, people were reading about Solon Trust's public humiliation over their breakfast meetings and power lunches. Somewhere else, Mira was probably staring at her phone, wondering how her life had gone from corner office to unemployment line in the span of 48 hours. But here on the lake, surrounded by pine trees and morning birdsong, none of that mattered. Here, I was just Reed Lawson, grandson of a railroad worker, sitting on a deck his grandfather had built, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, and watching the world be exactly as peaceful as it was supposed to be. The newspaper clipping would stay in that frame for as long as I lived in this house, not as a trophy or a monument to revenge, but as a simple reminder that treating people with respect costs nothing and treating them badly can cost everything. Pulling $8.5 billion out of Solon Trust was just the opening move in a chess game that most people didn't even know they were watching. The real satisfaction came 3 weeks later when I sat in my Honda, still the same beat-up car, because some things don't need to change just because your bank account has more zeros, outside the offices of Meridian Community Bank, a small institution that specialized in microloans and neighborhood development projects. The contrast couldn't have been more perfect. Where Solon Trust was all marble lobbies and intimidating glass towers designed to make regular people feel small, Meridian operated out of a converted Victorian house in a working-class neighborhood where kids still played stickball in the streets and old-timers sat on stoops arguing about baseball. The kind of place where a guy in jeans and a hoodie didn't stand out like a sore thumb. I'd done my homework on Meridian's president, Maria Santos, a former social worker who'd gotten tired of watching good people get turned down for loans just because they didn't have perfect credit scores or trust fund collateral. She'd started the bank with the radical idea that character mattered more than quarterly profit margins, that sometimes the best investments were the ones that helped single mothers start catering businesses or helped veterans open auto repair shops. The meeting lasted exactly 47 minutes. I walked in as Reed Lawson, construction worker with a crazy idea, and walked out having just committed the entire $8.5 billion to something I was calling the Community Futures Fund. Not a loan, not an investment expecting massive returns, but a nonprofit portfolio designed to do exactly what Solon Trust had never bothered to consider: actually help people. The irony was sweeter than my grandmother's apple pie. The same money that Solon Trust had used to generate fees for their marble lobbies and executive bonuses was now going to fund scholarship programs for kids whose parents worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. The same capital that had paid for Myra's designer suits was now backing sustainable startups run by people who shopped at thrift stores and drove cars older than some of their employees. But here's the part that would have made Myra's head explode if she'd known. I made sure that exactly $170, the same amount she'd laughed at, was automatically donated every month to 500 different scholarship accounts. Not because the recipients needed exactly that amount, but because I wanted to prove a point that would echo through the financial world for years to come. Every month, somewhere in America, A kid got $170 for books or school supplies or college application fees, funded by the money that came from the bank account of a man their benefactors would never meet. Every month, 500 families got a little help from the guy who'd been called a beggar for trying to invest that exact same amount. The paperwork for the Community Futures Fund was elegant in its simplicity. No complex derivatives, no offshore shell companies, no tax avoidance schemes that required teams of lawyers to explain. Just straightforward investments in housing cooperatives, educational programs, and small businesses that were trying to build something real in communities that traditional banks had written off as unprofitable. Maria Santos understood what Solon Trust never had. That respect isn't about the size of someone's portfolio. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person who walks through your door. When I told her about my experience at Solon Trust, she just shook her head and said, "Their loss is our community's gain." That night, sitting on my deck with a beer and watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson, I realized something important. Pulling my money out of Solon Trust had felt like justice, but putting it into the Community Futures Fund felt like purpose. One was about settling scores, the other was about changing the game entirely. The beautiful thing about real wealth isn't what it can buy you, it's what it can build for other people. And while Mira was probably updating her LinkedIn profile and wondering how her career had imploded so spectacularly, the money she dismissed as worthless was quietly changing lives across the country, one $170 donation at a time. For months after Solon Trust learned the most expensive customer service lesson in banking history, I decided to throw a dinner party. Not the kind of flashy affair that billionaires usually host to show off their wealth, but something quieter, more meaningful, the kind of gathering my grandfather would have appreciated. The guest list was carefully curated, old friends from my construction days who still didn't know about K. Ramil, young entrepreneurs whose startups were being funded by the Community Futures Fund, and a handful of former Solon Trust employees who'd quit in disgust after learning how their bank had treated a client seeking to invest just $170. My lake house had never hosted anything fancier than a poker game, but that night it felt like exactly the right place to celebrate what really mattered. We grilled burgers on the same deck where I'd read about Myra's resignation, shared stories about second chances and small beginnings, and talked about the kind of investing that actually changed lives instead of just padding quarterly reports. That's when Helena Glenmont showed up. I was refilling drinks when I spotted her through the kitchen window, standing at the edge of my driveway like she wasn't sure she had the right address. Myra's younger sister had always been the decent one in that family, the teacher who chose helping kids over chasing profit margins. But seeing her here, uninvited and obviously nervous, told me everything I needed to know about why she'd made the drive out to the lake. "Reed," she said when I opened the front door, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to talk to you. About Mira." I gestured toward the garden path that led away from the house, away from my guests and their laughter. "She's been having a rough time, I imagine. She's broken, Reed. Completely broken. No job, no prospects, no one in the industry will touch her after what happened. She's been blacklisted." Helena's eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying during the drive. "She didn't know who you were. She had no idea." I stopped walking and looked at her directly. "Exactly. What do you mean, exactly? That's the whole point, Helena. She didn't know, and she didn't care to find out. She saw someone who looked different from her usual clients and decided he was worthless. That's not ignorance. That's character." Helena pulled a crumpled pamphlet from her purse, smoothing it out with shaking hands. "What's this?" I smiled, recognizing the brochure for the Riverside Community Center, a program I'd quietly funded in Myra's old neighborhood. The same area where she'd grown up before climbing her way to the top of the corporate ladder, the same streets where she'd learned to look down on people who reminded her of where she came from. "Tell her the man she humiliated built this," I said, handing the pamphlet back to her. "And tell her it's not named after me. It's named after the people she called beggars." These days, I start every morning the same way, walking through the community garden that sits on land my first investment helped reclaim from an abandoned lot in East Brooklyn. It's not the kind of place that makes headlines or wins awards, just a quiet patch of green where tomatoes grow in neat rows and sunflowers reach toward the sky, like they're trying to touch something better than the concrete jungle surrounding them. The garden doesn't know I'm a billionaire. The kids playing on the swing set their parents built from donated lumber don't care that I used to be married to a woman who called people like their families beggars. The elderly folks tending their herb plots just see another guy in jeans who shows up early and doesn't mind getting dirt under his fingernails. There's a small plaque on the gate. Nothing fancy, just weathered bronze with simple words. "Respect is grown quietly." Most people walk past it without reading, but that's fine. The best lessons are usually the ones nobody notices until they need them. This morning, like every morning, I stopped by Mrs. Rodriguez's corner where she grows the best peppers in 3 boroughs. She's 86, speaks mostly Spanish, and makes coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She doesn't know that the man who funded this garden is the same one who brought down Solon Trust with a whisper. The world still doesn't know I'm K. Ramil, and I like it that way. Power that needs to announce itself isn't really power at all, it's just noise. Real strength grows in silence, takes root in small acts of kindness, blooms when nobody's watching. Sometimes I think about Mira, wonder if she ever drives past this place and remembers the neighborhood where she learned to be ashamed of being poor. Wonder if she understands yet that the greatest revenge isn't destroying someone, it's becoming everything they never had the courage to be. But mostly, I just tend the garden and watch children play, knowing that the boy who couldn't afford to take his wife to fancy restaurants became the man who built playgrounds for kids whose parents worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. The storm nobody predicted turned out to be the quiet rain that makes everything grow. And somewhere in the city, in boardrooms and banks where they still whisper about the day a construction worker brought down someone trust, they're learning that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who scream the loudest. They're the ones who smile politely, say nothing, and let their actions plant seeds that bloom into consequences. I am the storm that whispers. And Mira? She lives forever with the memory of one moment, one laugh, one insult that cost her everything she thought mattered. While I tend gardens and change the world one seed at a time.